Just 1 week after launching a rather lengthy demo, Bethesda has released the final version of Prey. With that demo still fresh in our minds then, we were curious to see if the final game, with the latest patch installed of course, has managed to address any of our complaints raised in the previous video. Beyond that, we were especially curious about the PC version. After all, while CryEngine has a great history on the PC, Arkane's last game, Dishonored 2, running on the id-Tech-derived Void engine, certainly does not. Let's start with a look at the console versions then and see what has changed since the demo. One of the first questions we had is simple: does the final game offer anything for PS4 Pro owners? The demo version certainly did not, but the retail package for the game does sport a PS4 Pro logo. Unfortunately, it becomes immediately clear that the game offers nothing extra for Pro users. It looks identical to the standard PS4 version. Both are 1080p at 30 frames per second with low levels of texture filtering. This is a game that benefits greatly from an increased resolution, as we'll see when we look at the PC version, so it's a real shame that Arkane has left Pro owners on the sidelines. Then there's the matter of input latency. Xbox One fares well enough here, but the PS4 demo feels extremely laggy and unresponsive. In a game with difficult, fast-moving enemies, it's a real problem. In the final game then, there does appear to have been some adjustments made to the right stick look function, and it does feel somewhat better to play, but input lag remains, and the PS4 version is still the least responsive of the three by quite a wide margin. Okay, so how about the overbearing music used when an enemy would appear on screen? In the demo version, it sounded like this. And it got old fast since this blaring music was played whenever an enemy showed up. In the final game, the loud music still kicks in for larger battles, but it's less grating and the volume is reduced somewhat. Listen to the difference here. And that's just for the larger battles. Single enemy encounters play more like this. Here's another comparison. Much better overall, I think. In fact, the sound mix as a whole feels more refined and enjoyable in the final game. Loading times then were another issue, and unfortunately, things haven't really changed. In general, loading screens tend to range from 40 seconds up to 70 seconds on PlayStation 4, and slightly higher on Xbox One. It's true that each map is rather large by itself, but the game asks players to regularly travel between different areas, which can lead to a situation where you have a quick succession of very lengthy loading screens. It drags down the otherwise great pacing here. Now, Prey admittedly does fare better than most other CryEngine games on consoles, but it's still a little too long for our tastes. The rest of the experience then remains about the same. It's 1080p on PlayStation 4 and the Pro, 900p on Xbox One, and both versions target 30 frames per second. On PS4, you do get a very stable 30 frames per second without any real dips even during intense combat. It's certainly one of the smoothest CryEngine experiences you can have on a console by quite a wide margin, though it is arguable whether 30 frames per second is enough for a game like Prey with its very fast-moving enemies. Still, the stability of the experience here suggests that a proper PS4 Pro patch with a higher rendering resolution should be completely possible, as there does appear to be plenty of headroom for it. Hopefully this will follow in a patch, but really it should have been there from the beginning. We did test with boost mode enabled just to check, of course, but it doesn't really make a difference here, and it runs fine to begin with even on the standard PS4. Now, Xbox One is rather interesting, and it highlighted an issue that I did not expect. But first, here's a quick refresher on the demo. It's overall very smooth, right? I installed this demo and the full game on an external drive without issue, but upon reaching this same area in the final game, I encountered this instead. My first thought was, there's no way it could be this bad, right? I mean, that's not right. So I grabbed the hard drive, moved the game over to a standard Xbox One as opposed to the Xbox One S I'm using here, and saw similarly terrible results. Performance just wasn't smooth. But it turns out running the game from an external drive is the real issue that I was having here, and moving the game over to the Xbox One's internal storage instead solved these issues entirely. It runs just as well as the demo version now, as you can see from this footage. So was the first hard drive going bad then? To find out, I tried another external drive and encountered similar but less severe issues. This time I used a spare drive that I had previously removed from a PlayStation 4 during an upgrade. Other games I've tested appear to work just as intended when installed on these external drives, including the Prey demo itself, but the final game is really giving us problems. There's always going to be some variability here with different hard drives, so your mileage may vary, but just to be sure, I might suggest installing Prey to your Xbox One's internal drive to ensure smooth performance, because it does run fine when installed there. Okay, but enough about the consoles. Both versions are very decent, but between the input latency on PS4 and the very lengthy load times, it's clearly not the optimal way to enjoy the game. So where does that leave the PC? Well, to put it simply, this is the way to play Prey. Yes, it's usually true that PC games are going to offer the better experience, but console releases this generation have generally been pretty good. Prey is a unique case though, where the PC version offers an experience so much better than the consoles that it almost changes the game. Prey feels as if it were designed first and foremost as a proper PC game, then shoehorned into consoles. That's to say, this is no Dishonored 2. Straight away then, the most obvious improvement stems from loading times. With Prey installed to an SSD, or in fact even a slower mechanical drive, loading times are a mere fraction of what you get on consoles. This is important here as the design of the game focuses on a large interconnected space station. You will be going back and forth between areas often, and the rapid loading times on PC help make for a much more pleasant experience all around. Then you grab the controls and it gets even better. Whether you opt for a keyboard and mouse or a gamepad, Prey just feels infinitely more responsive on the PC. A big part of this comes down to the higher frame rate of course, but even at 30 FPS, the game does feel better. The unpredictable mimics which skitter around at a high speed suddenly make a lot more sense when you're playing on a PC at a high frame rate with more responsive controls. Even better, the developers have crafted an interface which feels pretty natural on the PC. When using a gamepad, you get the very same workable interface that we see on consoles, but switch over to a mouse and keyboard, and the interface instantly becomes more intuitive and natural. Looking at performance then, it doesn't take an especially powerful machine to reach high frame rates either. Dave looked at the game earlier this week and found that 60 frames per second could easily be achieved on lower end hardware. In my case, I used something a little faster though, using a GTX 980 Ti coupled with a 5820K, and the game turned in a locked 60 frames per second at 1440p with all settings fully enabled. So how does it stack up against the console version in terms of visuals then? And how about that options menu? Well, to start with, there's full support for the typical settings, including arbitrary resolutions and various window and full screen options. If you dig into the advanced settings, there is a lot more to adjust though, and this makes a pretty big difference in terms of the visual quality. At first glance, it may not seem like this has a huge impact on the overall image, but once you start comparing, it's clear that the PC version can produce a far more refined looking game. For starters, there's screen space reflections, which is a big one. This adds a lot of depth to the world, but surprisingly, the feature is completely absent on consoles. We only see cube maps instead on both PS4 and Xbox One. On PC, you can enable full or half resolution reflections, though the full resolution option doesn't always seem to work without toggling off and full at each launch of the game, unfortunately. Then we have screen space directional occlusion used to handle contact shadows. It looks great, but can prove expensive on less capable hardware, so you may have to drop down to half resolution. We also see a difference in shadow quality and object detail. shadow quality determines both the clarity of the shadows themselves and the distance at which they appear. Console draw distance is comparable to the PC high setting, but the actual rendering quality is reduced below this level. While we're here, look at this point in the distance. Notice how the room is lit and detailed on PC using the highest settings? This is determined by object setting. This controls the distance in which lights and objects are drawn. There are also several anti-aliasing options on PC, of course, and these options appear slightly sharper than the more aggressive console solution. Here's how all 4 of the included anti-aliasing methods on the PC stack up against one another. Keep in mind that the console version doesn't really fit into any of these, but is closest to SMAA T2X, only a little blurrier. Unfortunately, none of the AA options can cope with the significant specular aliasing present throughout the game. Ultimately, unless you're running lower end hardware, you really shouldn't need to adjust many of these settings, as even a modest PC can enjoy Prey at 60 frames per second with all options enabled. But do keep in mind that during our testing we did run into a number of different types of bugs. One of the most noticeable things is the variation in the way shadow maps draw. Sometimes they would appear, sometimes they would take a while to load, and sometimes they wouldn't load at all. And it wasn't just on Nvidia. Also, the latest Nvidia driver can introduce some minor stuttering for some users. I noticed this as well and rolled back my driver to one driver prior, and it's been smooth sailing. Prey makes good use of CryEngine, but its limitations on console remain evident throughout. Long loading times are a serious problem, and the speed of the enemies doesn't play nicely with lower frame rates. So if you have the option, you have to play this game on the PC. And play it you should. I can't help but quickly weigh in on the quality of this one. Prey is a spiritual successor to System Shock 2 through and through, and it's quickly becoming a favorite of mine. It's an exceptionally well-designed game that feels like a love letter to classic PC gaming. If you've enjoyed these types of games in the past, definitely give it a look. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.